Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you joining us, we're just leaving it a minute or so to make sure everyone out in the waiting room can get in. Welcome, everybody. Alrighty. Listen, thank you so much. I'm questioning everyone's life decisions. It's such a lovely evening. I'm not entirely sure why you guys are here listening to us. No, don't say that. Don't run off now. But we're here today, folks, to talk about what is the real cost of food. Now, just some housekeeping before I introduce the session and introduce our wonderful panelists for the evening. So just you guys I know have been through a bazillion Zoom webinars, but anyway, it's like the fire. I will start with the fire exits. The exit is your front door. So there we go. And you shouldn't have a fire alarm. So if that goes off, you got to leave. Aside from that, please keep your microphones and cameras off and leave it off throughout. The event is being recorded, ladies and gentlemen, in case you didn't know that. Please do, we will open the floor to questions about halfway through the session. So please stick your questions into the Q&A. So not the chat, but the Q&A, because that's the panel I'll be monitoring and feeding questions through to the panel. And finally, this is a webinar that's organized by Cambridge Global Food Security. It is part of the series of Food for Thought panel events. The next one, for those of you who enjoy these activities, the next one is on the 25th of May at 6 p.m. on food self-sufficiency. So you get the theme. We like our food here. I love food. For that. So let me just introduce the topic to be addressed tonight about the real cost of food. I think it's not surprising to anybody that we're smack bang in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Okay, this includes our utility bills, this includes our petrol, diesel, and it includes our food. Okay, and so I guess the experts are saying that the households probably face the biggest squeeze on disposable incomes for at least 30 years. And here's the issue. Okay, on average, the lowest income families spend twice as much on food and housing bills as the richest families. Okay, in terms of, certainly in terms of proportion to their salaries, to what they're actually bringing in, and will therefore these price inflations, like any other time this happens, always disproportionately affects the poor. Now, on top of that, those of the poorest in society, the bottom quintile in society, are twice as likely to end up with diseases such as obesity and other diet-related illnesses, and that's just obesity and diet-related illnesses. So suddenly, we're looking at a sector of the population who A, can ill afford the price rises, but B, are still at a high risk of actually getting all forms of diet-related illnesses. And so Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which is currently being ignored by the government, let's not go there, spelt out problems and suggested solutions. And the key message was that Britain needs to change what it eats and how food is produced. Now, that's a complex topic. It's a big topic. So I guess, is healthy food the same as sustainable food? We're gonna talk about that. And what is the true cost of food? I mean, should fruit and vegetables be cheaper and unhealthy foods be more expensive? How does the status quo drive poor diets and damaging, farming practices? And how, in the extreme conditions we live, can we provide decent diets that actually leads to good health? And so in order to have this discussion tonight, I am joined by three eminent panelists. Now, first of all, my name is Giles Yeo. I am based here at the University of Cambridge, and I am in no way an expert in these topics. Let me tell you what I'm an expert at. I'm an expert in food, and when I mean in food, in the preparation and eating of food. I also happen to study obesity, so I study how the genetics of obesity and how we actually react to the environment. So why people are small, medium, and large. So I come from this from a very biological perspective, but we're not going to fix this just using biology. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists tonight, and that's Professor Tim Benton, who is the research director at Chatham House, Energy and Environment Resources Department, and works on a range of projects about how environmental risks interact with human systems. I mean, from 2011 to 2016, he was the champion of the UK's Global Food Security Programme, which was a multi-agency partnership of the UK's public bodies with an interest in the challenges around food. And then second, we have Dr. Sue Davies, who leads Which, the website and magazine that reviews items and reviews instruments, etc., who leads Which's policy on trade, food, and consumer product safety, wider consumer protections and rights, and sustainability. She has represented consumer interests on a range of national and international committees, and is currently a member of the government's Strategic Trade Advisory Group. She was chair of the European Food Safety Authority from 2012 to 2016, and has been awarded an MBE in recognition of her on her work on food safety. See, food on the mind. This is my problem. And last but certainly not least, it's Lucia Reisch, who is a German behavioral. I'm sorry if I murdered your name. Is a German behavioral economist and social scientist by training, and the El-Erian Professor of Behavioral Economics and Policy at the University of Cambridge since September 2021, and since April 2022, the professorship is located at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Before joining Cambridge, she was a professor at Copenhagen Business School. She also holds an honorary Leibniz professorship from the Leibniz Institute for Prevention Research in Bremen, as well as a guest professorship from Zeppelin University. So, welcome to my three panelists. The way the evening is going to work is each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to set out their stall, where they're coming from. We'll then have a few minutes of an in-group discussion. You guys can please, to encourage you to put questions into the Q&A, and then I'll open questions to the floor, and we'll take it to around 6:20, 6:25 this evening. So you've heard from me bang on for too much. So let me introduce our first speaker this evening, who is Tim Benton. Tim, please take it away.
Thanks, Giles. This is an enormous subject, and 5 minutes doesn't give me a lot of time to cover the basis. But if you just think within the UK system, the economic value of agriculture from a GDP perspective is about £10 billion. The direct costs of producing food from a pollution perspective and a climate change perspective are around £10 billion. And the ill health costs that come from eating poor diets varies, depending on the estimate, between 30 and 60 billion pounds. So we have a food system that gives us a certain amount of income and costs us an enormous amount, and that is the externalization of costs onto the environment and onto healthcare systems. And we've known since the mid-Victorian time, W.S. Jevons in 1865 first pointed it out, that demand is created not just by the exogenous properties of the market, but demand is created by innovating on the supply side. And within the food system and within agriculture, we have innovated and innovated and innovated through the Green Revolution. We've liberalized markets, we've stimulated global supply, we have created global markets, prices have declined, availability of calories has increased and increased and increased. And we have had a political notion over the last 60 or 70 years that food should become ever cheaper and ever more available. And this cheaper food paradigm creates a range of overlapping and often self-reinforcing mechanisms which ratchet up the negatives that come from our food system. They incentivize economic behavior, that creates the negative outcomes for society and the environment through the Jevons paradox. So just to quickly whiz over them, as we have liberalized markets and created global supply chains, and as we have increasingly invested in the intensification of certain crops over other crops, we have driven down the price of many of the staple crops, grains particularly, and these are now sufficiently cheap to be directly to be diverted from human consumption to farmed animals. This allows us to produce more meat and led to the growth of the global herd, which has negative consequences for air and water quality and greenhouse gas emissions. The fact that we have cheaper, more and more cheaper calories that come from a small number of staple crops means that we have access to calories and lack of access to nutrition. If everybody in the world wanted to eat a healthy 5 a day fruit and vegetables, the world only produces a third of the fruit and vegetables required and produces over 50% too many calories through grains and vegetable oil and so on. As we grow more and more of less and less, food prices have fallen on a global basis. Availability has increased. This means it's economically rational now for many people to waste food, and huge amounts of food waste is occurring at scale from farm to flush. The more food becomes globally available, the more we waste it, the more we demand it, and that creates a self-reinforcing system. And as the per capita availability of food on a global basis has increased, so have the emissions from our food system, and global food system now accounts for about a third of greenhouse gases emissions that are human caused. And so food systems are becoming a major driver of climate change, and climate change in itself is now increasing the volatility of our food system and causing it in some senses to create more volatility in prices, and then that drives some of the issues that we have seen in 2022 to 2023. We have therefore, over the last 60 years, built a market-based food system that drives these negative reinforcing impacts that and based on the notion that cheaper food is a public good, rather than recognizing the food system should be there for public benefit. It should have a fundamental focus on feeding people in a way that is nutritious and sustainable. And instead, we have a food system that is increasingly subject to market failure. So yes, I would say because of the externalization of food, of costs onto the environment, onto the healthcare system, food prices are too cheap. But does this mean that they should go up necessarily? No. The cheaper food paradigm has been decades in the making, really since the tail end of the Second World War, with the initial Bretton Woods institutions being formed. The notion behind it is that if we spend less on food, we can spend more on other forms of economic consumption, driving up the economy. And as food prices have fallen, we have locked ourselves in, often through contracts, into spending our money, and we have most people have very little freedom to suddenly go from 10% household diet spent on 10% of household income spent on diet to 20% or 30%. But if we manage this over a period of decades, it is possible to imagine paying more for food in terms of internalizing the externalities. We need a long-term strategy. It's not a matter of saying, oh, tomorrow you'll have to double your price on food. Internalizing the externalities can be done in many ways, through changing taxes, subsidies, trade rules, carrots and sticks, and so on. Healthier diets, if we could create a marginal change in UK diabetes rates, for example, could save enough money to pay every farmer to farm in a different way and to underpin better social safety nets. It's not about forcing people to pay more. It is a matter of restructuring the market to get the incentives in the right places. And it's not a matter of making all foods more expensive. It is about making the better foods cheaper and more available, and the worse foods more expensive, and also reducing waste. We did some modeling a few years ago and showed that it would be possible for the vast majority of the world to eat better if we internalised the costs and if we shifted subsidies around and so on, eat better, more nutritiously, and from a cheaper perspective from a household. Final point, if we don't internalise these externalities, we make the situation worse year on year, decade on decade, generation on generation. As time passes, more and more people will become vulnerable. And who are the most vulnerable? The economically marginalised. So not doing something over the long term to protect today's poor at the expense of tomorrow's is not a just solution. So we have to find a way to navigate this intergenerational equity as well as the problems of today. Back to you, Giles.
Thank you very much, Tim. Gosh, every day is a school day. We'll get back to you with some questions. Folks, as questions come up, please, can I encourage you to stick them into the Q&A, and remember, not the chat. Our second speaker this evening is Sue Davies. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Giles. I wanted to talk about the real cost of our food, first of all, in terms of the short term, well, hopefully short term, but the immediate cost of living crisis that we're going through at the moment, that obviously Tim's also talked about, and then talk about the toll that our food system is taking more broadly on our health and on the environment. I think to start off with, we really are in quite an unprecedented situation at the moment with food price rises. We're seeing the highest food price inflation that we've had for 45 years, which now publishes a monthly food price inflation tracker. And that is showing, you know, as others like Kantar are showing, that there are really significant increases in some quite staple foods, particularly with dairy foods, for example, have been really increasing. And across the board, we know that people are starting to really suffer as a result of this. We know from the research that we've been doing that many people are trading down. We've been doing a regular consumer insight tracker over each quarter, and that's painted a really depressing picture where we've seen people who were doing fine or thought they were okay, were conscious of the cost of living crisis a few months ago, really starting to struggle now. Obviously, as Giles said, that there are big differences in the amount of money that people are spending on food as a proportion of their household income. So some people have always found this difficult, but we're seeing an increasing number of people who are now struggling. We know that people are concerned about food price rises, and people are changing their behaviour in a number of ways. So for some people, that is about shopping around. It is about using the discount supermarkets more, and we're seeing their share really increase quite significantly. But from our research, we know that an increasing number of people are having to take more drastic steps. So in February, for example, our survey showed that 1 in 7 people said that they were now having to skip meals. 1 in 10 people said that they were prioritising meals for other family members. And 4% of people were having to use a food bank. So we're seeing a lot of stress that people are going through. We know that as a result of this, they're also sceptical of the supermarkets, apart from the discounters. So we've seen a drop in trust in the supermarkets where people are unsure about the reasons for these price rises. But obviously they're being caused by a very broad range of global factors, as well as specific issues for the UK. That makes it very challenging at the moment, although predictions are that the prices will start to drop soon. We've also seen from our research that health is suffering, or people think that it is becoming more difficult to eat healthily. So we did a big general population survey in August, and that showed that 46% of people said that it was becoming more difficult to eat healthily because of the cost of living crisis. But what was really worrying is that when we asked people about their financial situation, it was unsurprisingly those who are struggling the most financially who said it was much more difficult. And that then jumped to 80% of people who said that they were finding it more difficult to eat healthily because of the current crisis. It's clear, therefore, at the moment that people need a lot more support, and there's a really important role for government and providing a safety net for people, making sure that there are the right protections in place as people are trading down. we've developed a priority places for food index with the University of Leeds, which brings together a range of different indicators to identify the parts of the country at quite a small geographical area where we know that people are going to be struggling the most. And that combines a range of factors, including factors relating to income, but also factors relating to physical access to food, for example. And we launched our Affordable Food for All campaign, where we've been calling on the supermarkets to step up and do a lot more to support people. And that includes by making sure that there are affordable, but also healthy ranges available, by making sure that they are using their promotions in a way that supports people in making healthy choices, as well as sustainable choices, ideally. And then also that you've got clearer and more transparent pricing. But we've seen a limited response to date in terms of those calls on supermarkets. I think that there is obviously a big focus at the moment on the short-term issues that we're dealing with, and there is a danger that that takes the spotlight off some of the longer-term changes that Tim has set out so comprehensively that we need to be focusing on. And because we've seen a range of factors that are driving this inflation, we need to make sure that we've got a more sustainable system and a much more resilient system that is better able to withstand these types of shocks, so we don't have this sort of situation continuing to crop up over the coming years. But that requires a much more concerted effort that really recognises, as Tim has set out, just how much our food system is damaging our health and what those longer term costs are for the NHS, for the environment. I think Henry Dimbleby did make that case incredibly well, and he set up out a strategy and a range of measures that would make a significant difference. But it's very difficult. I think, well, it shouldn't be very difficult, but we've seen that government has been unwilling to actually follow through on that. There are some actions that are being pursued, but not on the scale and ambition that is needed. So we need to have a much more joined up approach that really helps to tackle some of these fundamental challenges, but also support people in making affordable and healthy and more sustainable choices. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an oversight of some of the issues that we're hearing from people and the things that they're feeling at the moment that I think we really need to factor in when we're talking about what the real cost of food is, and certainly when thinking about whether food should be more expensive when many people are really, really struggling at the moment. So it's, I think, detracting that from the wider policy that is the responsibility of government and ultimately the food industry to support people in making those choices.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was wonderful. And the third and final speaker before we head to questions, and please do continue putting your questions into the Q&A box. That'd be fantastic. It's Lucia Reisch. Please, Lucia, take it away.
Thank you. So I have 5 quick points to make. First is true costs are about externalities and internalities. We've heard a lot about externalities, but there's also in behavioral economics, we know so-called internalities, which are adverse effects or costs on oneself. So mainly health costs. So for instance, eating an unhealthy diet now can have health effects in the future. And unfortunately, and I know that because I'm a consumer researcher also and a behavioral economist, we're not very good to our future selves and systematically favor our current selves, particularly when we are young. We believe we live forever. And as consumers, we have strong present bias. We prefer the now to the later. We procrastinate decisions into future land. We're pretty good in ignoring or even reinterpreting information we do not like, and are often too busy or lazy to make informed consumer decisions. So we are basically cognitive misers and heavily influenced by the immediate choice context. What I want to say is targeting the consumer with information and education only will be hardly successful if we want to see behavioral changes, which are needed if we want to change the food system, consumers being a very integrative part. Second point, it's by far not clear and highly political what's included in true costs of food and what is not included. So there are many different approaches, and it's important to know the differences and the quality of the data also the measurements are based on. And so beyond the immediate costs of production, transportation, there are environmental, social, health effects. Some are positive, but most are negative. And as far as I know the literature, the most comprehensive approaches usually include costs from 5 domains. And let me illustrate that with one example, which is meat. So in the environment, Tim already talked about climate change, so greenhouse gases. Food system is a main emitter globally, but also biodiversity loss. In the UK, the abundance of key species has fallen dramatically in the past 50 years, and many species are close to extinction. We talk about water and air pollution due to fertilizers, soil degradation, land use changes, monoculture for livestock feed, etc. Second, we have social costs, which is sometimes called the social costs of meat, which is about unfair wages, bad working conditions. In the US, currently, there's even a law underway to stop child labor in the US in meat packing, which seems surprising. I mean, we are now in the year 2023. So it's about exploitation and undervaluing of social groups that are sometimes counted as social costs. Then we have societal costs. Sue talked about social inequality and distributional effects. Meat is a status symbol in both ways, eating it and not eating it. It also depends very much on the nation and on the culture. So there are some potential positive, but largely negative impacts. Fourth are the health costs. We talked about obesity, all kind of diet-related health impacts, but also issues like antimicrobial resistance. And the fifth point that has not yet been made is about animal welfare and ethical questions. And it really matters what you include in the measurement. And it will also depend very much on who actually makes the measurement and calculates the costs. It will also depend on the region, because the different regions might have different priorities, which means politicians will have to make decisions on which of those sometimes conflicting dimensions are most important. Third, here's some good news. We're getting better data, more evidence, at least as regarding greenhouse gas emissions, which is probably the most progressed cost element when it comes to measurement and evaluation. And the research assessing agricultural climate costs looks into farming systems and food categories. Usually we use life cycle assessment, and then we can show the external greenhouse gas costs. What we see, that's a bit rough, but in general, it depends mainly on the food type. So we have animal-based on top, and then plant-based and dairy. The highest is for conventional organic animal-based products. A little bit less is conventional dairy products, and the lowest for organic plant-based products. And of course, there's different studies with different methodologies and different prices for the cost of carbon per ton, but all of them show that there is a substantial surcharge on producer price level, which can be very small, as I said, like about 6% for organic plant-based products, up to very high, talking about up to 240% for conventional ruminant meat. Interestingly, the differences regarding greenhouse gas emissions between farming systems, so conventional versus organic farm, are rather small. So organic is better, but only a bit. However, that changes when you look at other dimensions, such as biodiversity. This is why it's so important to look at all the different elements of the external cost. Fourth, potential solutions are there, but very hard to implement. I'm sure that Tim, who has been, and also Sue, who have been in this policy domain for long, sometimes think, why aren't we more advanced here? I mean, we have a polluter pays principle since decades, and there's a consensus that externalities and internalities are market failures, reduce welfare, need correction. And there have been great reports published also in the UK. The problem is really implementation. The question is why, and I think we really have to talk about the toolbox of instruments that targeting different actors in the food system. Some are upstream, some more downstream. And fifth, talking about those instruments, there are many. I personally work a lot about behavioral instruments, but I do think that we should at least not rule out a meat tax, a social cost of meat. It might not be a bad idea. It's really about how it is designed. There's good and not and worse ways how to design it. It's also about how the revenues are used. One could do a lot of good with the revenues. There could also be payback schemes, very much alike what we now have in the climate policy. And there are some good and some worse examples. For instance, I lived in Denmark for a long time. Denmark had a fat tax in 2011. It was abolished 2 years later, but it did have some positive impact. And there were other ones that we can learn from. There are models showing the advantages and also the pitfalls. So my point is here, consider all, do not rule out something like a tax that allegedly is not accepted by the public and hence high risk for policymakers. There has been, just in January, the BIT, the Behavioral Insights team, has done an RCT and asked for different types of designs of a meat tax and its acceptance in the UK, in a representative study. And they found that if the tax is framed as not specifically as a meat tax, but generally on foods that have a high climate impact, and also if the tax does not target the individual consumer, but industry, which means they would change recipes, for instance, or technologies in processed food, it's actually pretty well accepted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Okay, if I can have Sue and Tim, your lovely visages, back on again. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do continue sticking your questions in. If I'm under, I might just kick off with a question each for each of you. And the first one is directed to you, Tim, but I would appreciate anybody's else's thoughts as well. What is, maybe it's not a simple question, maybe it's not. What is the current cost? Sorry, what is the current cause of this food inflation? What's driving it up so much? I mean, you listen to the government, they're saying Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. They're not going to say the B word. But is that too simplistic? So what is the current driver of food inflation?
So 4 things, really. One is we've had a lot of climate change disruption over the last year or two, and that's still ongoing. The second thing is that we're still living off the back of COVID and supply chain disruptions. And COVID in itself is probably made more likely by environmental degradation and climate change, and I can go into the details of that if there's a reason. The third thing is, of course, Ukraine and the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and some of that is driven by the geopolitics of wanting to effectively corner, so a failing petro-state Russia wanting to corner the next big market that will give political leverage, which is the global food market. Had Russia taken Ukraine in 5 days, it would have been a very smart thing to do from a geopolitical perspective. Brexit is kind of part of the whole mix in terms of the supply chain disruptions. And then, of course, all of the above interacting together means that the dollar has strengthened and exchange rates have gone down. And so particularly for import-dependent countries in the global south, food is much more expensive to buy, even though real costs have come down since this time last year. So all of these things together are all part and parcel of the dysfunctionality of our food system. And as we expect climate change and other things, more geopolitical tension going ahead, as Sue mentioned in her intervention, we expect more and more disruption to come from our food system. And we have to restructure the markets from a volatility perspective, as well as a sustainability perspective and external cost perspective. Over.
Thank you so much, Tim. Sue, then over to you. I guess here's the question is, how can we as a society, it's a very broad question, transition from a food system that is deeply unjust at the moment, I would think, particularly for people on the tight budget, and which has been made worse by the rise in energy. I mean, in particular, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how we can actually convince the government to think beyond the short term. I mean, maybe this is a broader question for everyone here, but how can we, what are some practical things we can do to try and aid this transition, particularly for those who can least afford being in this cost of living crisis at the moment? Sue.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think there's some immediate things. As I said, I think people are facing some real difficulties and there's an important role for government. We've been supporting other campaigning groups who've been calling for expansion of free school meals, for example, expansion of the Healthy Start scheme. And we've just done some research that shows that there's low levels of take up in some areas of Healthy Start, even though that support is available. And government, I think, also has a really important role providing basic protections at the moment. So it's quite worrying that at the time we're having this conversation, and we should be thinking about how do we help support people in making healthy and sustainable choices and shift our food system, that we've got this retained EU law bill that is potentially going to sunset 90% of our food laws by December, unless we get some fundamental change to that legislation as it goes through the Lords and goes to the House of Commons. And we've got this deregulatory drive. So some of the measures intended to make it easier for people to eat healthily, such as controls over food marketing and promotions, for example, have been put on hold. So I think there's what needs to be done in the short term to support people who are struggling and need to be able to know that if they are trading down, that they've still got the basic food safety protections and they can still act on the kind of values that they think are important and that we've always assumed underpin our food system. But I think in terms of the longer term transition, I think it's very frustrating because we've been talking about this for a long time. As I mentioned, I think Henry Dimbleby set out quite clearly what the problem is and set out some concrete proposals. But it requires food policy being a much bigger priority within government, and it requires a much more joined up approach across government and also across the devolved nations as well. And some of the devolved administrations have gone further in terms of introducing food policies, but we need something that brings food policy right central within government, so that whether we're talking about DEFRA or the Food Standards Agency, but also the Department for Business and Trade, for example, we're talking about Department for Work and Pensions, that we need to have a much more joined up approach. And what we always tend to see is short-term approaches, as I mentioned, with the deregulatory agenda that we're seeing, but also in the way that we're approaching trade deals, which has been very focused on and trying to maintain food standards. We're seeing contradictory things being built into trade deals, for example, the Australia deal, that could potentially undermine our transition to a more sustainable system and remove some of the incentives for our producers to be doing more to reduce their impact. So we need to have that cross-cutting food policy, and it has to be a government priority. And I think there's already a plan in place that the government should be acting on, but unfortunately, they didn't actually pick that up, and we ended up with a very weak food strategy from the government instead. Thank
you so much, Sue. Question for you, Lucia. I love the term you use, cognitive misers. I'm going to steal that, incidentally. I'm gonna let you know, Lucia. But the question for you has to do with us cognitive misers. Is how can consumers drive the change in what we eat? I mean, so I guess my point is, how do we convince the consumer? Okay, and I guess you've got to convince the middle class consumers first, who actually have some agency in this decision and choosing to pay more for stuff. But how do you actually get people to change their minds with us miserly cognitive, poor mammals that we are?
Yeah. Well, it's actually pretty rational to be a cognitive miser, because we have so many things to do and to decide, and we have only 24 hours and are not 24 hours well-informed consumers. It's simply not possible. So it's not that we're irrational. We're pretty rational. So I think maybe two things. So I did focus on the consumer because this is an important actor. However, let's not forget that those systematic issues, those context factors that really are solved up higher in the system, the food system level, are absolutely important because they present the context within which consumer decisions take place. And we are heavily context dependent. Context is, of course, prices, but not only. It's all about accessibility, about availability, about social pressure, about cultural norms, about expectation. What is a good meal for my family? What do the neighbors expect? So there's many kind of hard and softer factors. But answering your question is, so consumers are, there's different ways how to do that. The best thing is probably to start early. I mean, that's always the same answer, but it's actually pretty true. So something like in psychology, it's called the mere exposure effect. So expose children to diverse food, which is actually hard to do in some disadvantaged areas, like in food deserts, is important thing to do. And here is where also our public canteens and kindergartens and schools and later universities have their place, because this is where healthy or planetary health diets can actually be served with the respective subsidies and can be presented as the normal. Also tastes develop, right? So exposure to the right type of food. Then also all kind of using choice architecture to expose people to that type of food that we think is welfare enhancing. Public provision is really a very good policy tool. So as I said, I lived many years in Copenhagen. So in Copenhagen, for instance, all the public canteens have decided since already some years ago, and this is also now politically widely agreed, that they reduced the meat dishes and have or try to get planned forward diets as the default, right? So I'm not saying this is easy, by the way, because there's always there's lobbies and also sometimes very engaged people who think that something is taken away from them, but it's possible. Again, as also Tim said, it takes time. It's nothing you do from one day to the next and it's solved. It takes a culture of learning, of accepting, and of also including all that knowledge that we have about the external costs and the internalities. The last thing is, that's something that is usually the first one that policymakers actually turn to. It's transparency. So if you ask consumers in polls, they usually say they want labels. They want labels that would explain the climate impact or the external costs of their food. And that's good to know. And they follow what we want them to say. On the other hand, we also know that de facto label use is, again, limited because we're cognitive misers. On the other hand, transparency is never wrong, because it's not just towards consumers, but it's also a signal towards all the other actors to the other retailers, to the producers, to the media. So it does have its place.
Thank you so much, Lucia. I'm going to the audience questions now. Actually, one for you, Tim, from Andrea Costa. Can you elaborate on how a world restructuring could look like? More fruits, more vegetables, less meat, less sugar. What are the policies that could help the process? I mean, I say, Andrea says, apart from the tax to meat proposed, but what do you, can you elaborate on what you think that a restructuring of the food systems could look like?
So when I talk about market restructuring, it's to avoid the issues of saying it's down to consumers to make better choices. And and that's a big kind of greenwashing issue by big agriculture. We have designed the market to fail. The market is based on increasing consumption of calories. It's not based on doing something that's sustainable and good for nutrition. It's only designed around profit making at the moment. So when it comes to restructuring the market, in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, Table 5.6, we pulled together something like 20 families of policies that could be used to change the incentives about the way the market works. Trade, research, where you put your subsidies, even things like planning law. Do you allow a fast food outlet at the entrance to a school? Marketing issues, taxes, incentives for farmers, incentives for consumers, changing food environments, etc., etc. So there are many ways that you can make the market deliver better the public goods outcomes, which are people fed healthily in a way that's affordable, and food production outcomes, which is the sustainability agenda. And instead, we've got a market at the moment that rewards for market actors doing the wrong thing, producing large amounts of calories that contribute to a range of ill health in a way that is negative from a planetary perspective. So we need to change the way the market works rather than just say, oh, it's down to consumers to make better choices, which is often a politically useful excuse, but it doesn't work,
useless,
as Lucia has said. Yes.
Okay, got a couple of questions here that are related that I'm going to direct to you, Sue. The first one is a specific question from Anna Dermid-Zadki, who asked the question: the surveys that you guys were conducting, what age groups and socioeconomic backgrounds and geographical locations were you targeting? That's the first part of the question. The related question to that is that, has anyone looked at fresh food availability? And there's a specific example here from irrespective locations. Some 77% of Knowsley, I don't know where Knowsley is, Knowsley residents live in a food desert. So I guess the question is, when you conduct these surveys, what is the socioeconomic profile? Do you cover as many, everyone up and down the strata? To you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we use a range of different research techniques, and although which is funded largely by our members who subscribe to our products, we've got a bigger remit, obviously acting on behalf of all consumers and supporting them. So when we do our research, we make sure that we are speaking to sample sizes that are representative of the general population. So I talked about our consumer insight tracker that we do on a quarterly basis. So that is run by an agency for us that makes sure that we've got the right representation around the UK. We will also do a deep dive into the nations and do supplements for each of the nations to make sure that we have got data specifically on those for some issues. We will also do qualitative research. So we have a regular consumer insight panel, which is a smaller group, but enables us to monitor them over time and to understand what some of the challenges are that people are facing in a more in-depth kind of deliberative way. I mentioned the survey that we did in August, which was a big, massive general population survey that was focused, I think it was 2,000 sample size, but which was focused on how people were being affected by the cost of living crisis. But the priority places for food index that I mentioned is something that I think is quite unique, that we've developed with the University of Leeds Consumer Data Research Centre, where we pulled together, as I said, a range of different indicators. So that included things like, whether or not people were getting support for free school meals, but it also included things like how far away they were from food retail provision, for example, and whether or not they had access to the internet. But it was interesting that Knowsley, as you've mentioned, came out as one of the worst areas in terms of constituency, where the worst 20% in terms of people at risk of food insecurity, 95% of Knowsley had 95% of what we call priority places, which shows that that's an area where there needs to be a real focus, because we know that people there are going to be particularly vulnerable. Over on our index, sorry, not to go on too much, you can overlay where all the supermarkets are and what size of supermarkets there are. So I think that helps you the supermarkets to target what they're doing, including fresh fruit and veg availability, to make sure that it's available in those places, but also look at the promotions that they've got to help people in making those choices, because we know that people do want to generally eat healthily, but they struggle to do it. But it's also a tool, I think, more widely for others at a community level and for government as well, to also be looking at how you can support people who are most in need. So that's not to detract from, you know, everybody is being affected, but I think that really enables a targeted approach. So it's something quite new for which to develop, and we're very keen to work with others to look at how we can add to that and make it more effective and more meaningful, and obviously really get to the people who need support.
Thank you, Sue. A couple of questions here that are related that I'm going to put to you, Lucia. The first question was from Jack Shaw, and he asked, is cost of grain kept lower due to subsidies as well as innovations? And would it make sense to reduce or remove these for grain going into animal products, for example, but instead use these subsidies for fruits and vegetable production? Or would this make the exploitation in the meat industry worse? You know, and then there's an associated link to that, which may be too big a question to ask, is there a right amount of meat to eat? You know, and how much meat should we be eating in the current, not for health purposes, I'm talking just for environmental purposes that we actually are in at the moment. So subsidies for grains, should we be changing how we actually do that to meat? And actually in reality, how much, is there an ideal amount of meat to be eating for the environment that we're actually, sustainability in the environment we're talking about at the moment?
Yes, thank you. So starting with the latter, we know that we have to reduce, I mean, we, like the rich consumer of the global north in the industrialized countries, we have to reduce our meat consumption by 2/3 in order to have a chance to be within the planetary boundary. So that's a lot, which basically means more or less 1 meat dish per week and not 7 or 10. So that's quite dramatic. And this is also why I think everything that has to do with acceptability and availability, like public food provision, is so important, because it's going to be very hard for the individual to make those decisions unless you know, this person is really, really convinced or very strong-willed. We take about half of our calories, depending on our job, but about half of our calories is taken outside of the home, of our home, which means we are exposed all the time and we're defaulted into meals in many occasions during the week. So that does have a lot of impact. So I'm not an expert in agricultural policy, but of course, I mean, it's absolutely makes sense. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that is currently happening, at least within the EU agricultural policy. This is something I know more about, the UK one, that this whole system of not beneficial subsidies is going to be changed. And that goes back to, but again, you know, it's not just changing the type of subsidies. It's also about changing and thinking about which types of food, so the more the healthy ones, we should try to promote with lower VAT, for instance. And there might be other types of food where we might add the VAT, because they do have this immense amount of external and internal effects. And this is also what Tim said, or one of his questions, when he said, you know, no, overall food should not get more expensive, although I do not quite agree with that. It's really about which type of food should get more expensive and others should become cheaper. So, I mean, maybe last word on how expensive food should be. So the UK is has, I think, still, even with the inflation, still has some of the lowest food costs, between 8 and 10%. And I think only the US and Singapore have lower food costs. That is something that might not be on everyone's mind. So having lived in Denmark for a long time, which has some of the highest food prices, for different reasons, but also because some of those external effects are politically internalized. You know, I come really from a different perspective, and sometimes I'm quite surprised to hear people, I mean, I'm not talking about the lowest income quintiles. I mean, they have very, very serious problems, but I'm talking about the more affluent consumers complaining about food prices. It's no, go to other countries worldwide and you'll be surprised.
Thank you very much for that. There was a question here from Jessa, who's asking about the impact on food waste, and is that a low-hanging fruit that we should be tackling in a better way? Because as far as I understand, actually food waste is almost criminal. I mean, and I know, and look, I am guilty of food waste in terms of the amount of stuff that actually comes out of my fridge, you know, when I load it up. So I don't know who is, this is not directed to anyone in particular. Is there anyone here who feels comfortable addressing food waste and what? Okay, Tim, you got your hand up, and maybe let's see if you have something to add. Tim?
Yeah, so as I think I probably said in my opening remarks, food for most people, or many people, is cheap enough that it becomes economically rational to waste. You go to a supermarket or you have your online delivery, shove it in the fridge, and you find it slimy 3 days later or a week later, and you throw it out. But because it's cheap enough that you can do that. And so part of the issue, and Lucia said she didn't necessarily agree with me around the overall price of food. I think if you change the composition of your diet, fruit and vegetable is cheaper than prime steak or whatever. So, and if you reduce the waste, our modelling that Marco Springman led on a couple of years ago showed that on average, household food payments could go down to encourage a healthier, low waste diet. So your household spending. So even though food individually might become more expensive because you're buying less and differently, your food prices can go down. But I think what is not a sensible thing is to say, well, we only have to deal with food waste because food waste happens because of the food price issue. And it's just as stupid as saying, oh, it's down to consumers to change their buying habits when they can't very often. It's part of the systemic approach that we need to change to make food waste an issue that is not a sensible thing to do if you're a rational, relatively well-off person. Food waste is a rationality of the system.
That's a good point. Lucia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so food waste has been taken, I mean, finally, as a really serious problem. And for instance, in France, there are even laws forbidding food waste. So they're very strict these days about that type of food waste that goes on retail and transportation sectors of the food system. And of course, it's much more difficult to tackle that with consumers, but I think the awareness has risen dramatically. I mean, luckily, in the past years, that this is really something to absolutely avoid.
Okay, fantastic. Listen, amazingly, an hour is nearly gone. So I would like to wrap up now by having each of you give, I guess, a 1-minute closing thought, a takeaway message for our listeners this evening. Tim, you started the conversation. Do you have a 1-minute take home for us listeners?
Oh, wait, I was just scrolling through the many unanswered questions. I think the take home is that we have designed a system that doesn't work, and it is unjust for today's economically marginalized. It's unjust from a health perspective, and it's unjust from a planetary perspective. And the way of internalizing the externalities, there are many ways of doing that. It can be done by tax, it can be done by changing the price at the point of sale, it could be done by subsidies on farm, it could be done in many different ways, but we need to just accept that this is not a free market that is delivering what people want to eat. This is a biased market that is delivering and selling people the wrong things to make a profit. And we can change the market, we can restructure the market, and it's possible to do. It needs political leadership, which unfortunately we don't have at the moment.
Yes. You put it very mildly, very politely, Tim. Very good. Sue.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd agree with the political leadership point, and I think there's a need for support now, and also a need, as I said, for industry, particularly supermarkets and others who've got an important role and are at the front line in the way where people are buying their food, to really step up and support people more. But I think we do need a more ambitious plan to how we transform our system. And from all of the research that we've done, I think it's easy to assume that people don't care, but people are people do want to make healthier choices. They do want to make more sustainable choices, but the environment in which you're making those choices is challenging, and it's becoming even more challenging in the current climate. So that's why we need to make sure that government and businesses are supporting people. And when we've done research asking people, they want government to do more to make it easy to eat healthily and affordably. You know, they support measures restricting food marketing. They think supermarkets should be doing much more in terms of the balance of promotions. And, you know, there's a lot that people do expect to be supported on. And I think we just need to make sure that there is the ambition to do that, and that we get away from this very short-termist approach in terms of our food policy.
And last but not least, Lucia.
Yes, I think I would like to raise some opportunities that are out there. And as a researcher, I'm always interested in, does that work? And so there are a few studies out there looking into what happens actually when supermarkets are putting the second price tag on different types of food and making the true cost transparent. So this is done in the Netherlands, for instance, by True Price, which is a supermarket that has price tags that show all those issues, all those externalizations that we have discussed. There is an ongoing experiment in a German discounter Penny, with a second price tag. And interestingly, it showed in RCT showed that consumers who were provided with a true cost actually did de facto choose, in that case, organic rather than conventional milk. So there are some early experiments that are promising, and although I fully agree that it should not all the pressure should not put on the consumer, it's also, I mean, we also as consumers, we should take on some responsibility. And I think it's a big chance and opportunity also for retail to gain their social license to operate.
So guys, I'm going to have to wrap it up. First of all, can I just apologize to the audience for not getting to many of your questions, but it's heartening to see so many. But I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Tim Benton, Sue Davies, and Lucia Reisch this evening for tackling really quite a complex topic in not very much time at all. I want to remind everybody to please look out for the next event in the Food for Thought webinar series, which it's going to be on the 25th of May at 6 p.m. Should we become self-sufficient? But otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Professor Giles Yeo. I've been your host this evening. Thank you so much for taking your evening with us. Tim, Lucia, Sue, it's been wonderful having you. Have a good evening, folks.